Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Can someone unmute themselves and tell me how to make Treese the co-hostess here? Because I'm not seeing.
Normally, there are three buttons at the bottom of the host screen, and you can click on that, and one of them would be to designate a host.
Okay, all I see here is security, participants, chat, share screen, pause, stop recording, reactions. Yeah,
You go into the participants
okay,
and you should have a list of everyone there.
I
And
do.
On the right side, there should be a couple buttons, and one of them you can press and there'll be a drop down box that says make co-host, I believe.
Okay, then let me find Treese here. See if it'll let me do that. Chat. Okay, it says make host. It doesn't, because I want to be able to share screen.
Share, yeah. Share screen so you can show your PowerPoint.
Right.
I'm bringing in the big guns.
Okay, well, let's try to do this the best we can now. Before we start, just to remind, just a notice to everyone, next week, instead of Tuesday, this is going to have to be on Wednesday because the staff is having a development day on Tuesday. Okay, so next Wednesday, not next Tuesday. Your link already has the correct one. Okay, are we good?
That's good.
All right, I'm going to mute all of you. And I'm going to share my screen. And we will start. I can share my screen. Okay. All right. Hell and Purgatory. As usual, we'll take two breaks for discussion. One will be after Hell and Mortal Sin, then Hell, then Purgatory at the very end. Okay, so go back into the Catechism once again. 1033. We cannot be united with God unless we freely choose to love him. And again, here, we have to underline the word freely. This is really a part of Catholic doctrine, which 1500 years ago condemned a heresy called Origenism, which stated that the love of God was so unstoppable that all people would automatically be saved, whether kicking or screaming, they refused to be saved. So the question then of freedom is always a piece of human anthropology, Christian anthropology, including all of the issues of the beyond. So we cannot be united with God unless we freely choose to love him. But we cannot love God if we sin gravely against him, against our neighbor, or against ourselves. The Lord warns us that we shall be separated from him if we fail to meet the serious needs of the poor and the little ones who are his brethren. This, of course, is the great story of the separation of the sheep and goats, the Last Judgment story. To die in mortal sin without repenting and accepting God's merciful love means remaining separated from him forever by our own free choice. This state of definitive self-exclusion from communion with God and the blessed is called hell. Now, this is our definition. Please keep in mind, once again, that when we're talking about the beyond, we're not talking about a place, we're talking about an experience. And this is a very important piece that I want to spend some time on. I want to spend some time on this because this is a point upon which many people, having heard a certain catechism of fear and having heard a certain preaching style engendering fear, have tended to confuse the notion that hell is only reserved for mortal sin. Now, no accumulation of non-mortal sin can ever have the same effect as mortal sin. They are a difference in quality. They're not merely a difference in degree, it's a difference in category. The quantity of one non-mortal sin can never become the quality of the other, that is mortal sin. So here, many people have the notion that God is up there with this great big balance scale, and all of our sins are in one, and all of our good deeds are in another, and the two balance themselves out, and if the balance is negative, off to hell you go. The Catechism is very clear that this definitive separation from God is resolved to mortal sin. No conglomeration of venial sin or non-mortal sin ever admits one to hell. The analogy that I like to use, it's like being pregnant. Either you are or you aren't. There's no midway about it. It's mortal sin is the only thing that does that. Now, here, from the other end of it, lest we get too caught up in ease with this. Accumulation of non-mortal sin hardens the human heart and predisposes towards more serious sin. Meaning, of course, that the first time we infract against a law or a rule or a regulation, the easier it is to do it the second time, and the easier it is to do it the third time, and the easier it is to do it the fourth time, etc., etc., etc. This is the same question regarding a certain accelerating pattern of the human addictive process. That people generally start with a glass of wine, and then it turns into a half a bottle of wine, and then it turns into a couple of shots of whiskey, and then it turns into a half a bottle of whiskey, and then it turns into et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, we build up a certain tolerance for sin, and our sinful nature wants more and more and more. So this accumulation of non-mortal sin hardens our heart and predisposes us more and more towards mortal sin. But until we actually cross that line, we are never formally refused from beatitude. Now, with that in mind, we have to step back and get some notion about what do we mean by mortal sin. And here, several other sections of the Catechism. Catechism 1855. Mortal sin destroys charity in the human heart. This is a very definitive thing, that the capacity for God to move your heart, the capacity to respond to love in love, the capacity to do some good has been wiped out from that human person. Now, the only way to get beyond that is in 1856. Mortal sin, by attacking the vital principle within us, that is charity, necessitates a new initiative of God's mercy and a conversion of heart, which is normally accomplished within the setting of the sacrament of reconciliation. In other words, the human heart has to reboot. The computer system is no longer capable of doing its job. You have to turn the sucker off and reboot it in the sacrament of reconciliation. That's what this means. Now, CCC, Catechism, 1857. For a sin to be mortal, 3 conditions must together be met. Now, here, objectively speaking, as a historian, much traditional Catholic theology put way too much weight on the first condition, which is grave matter. Many people, even today, and this is my experience with some older people who still come to confession, they have the notion that if you do a certain thing, that in itself is mortally sinful, no matter what the condition might be. So, for example, I've heard confessions that go in this way. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I didn't go to communion last Sunday because I couldn't go to confession and I missed Mass the Sunday before. Okay, why did you miss Mass on the Sunday before? Well, because I was in the hospital and I couldn't get to Mass. For this certain class of people, the very act of doing that was in itself mortal. To give you another example of this, I'm told, I've never seen the rubrics for myself, but I'm told that a priest celebrating the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite, the Tridentine Mass, the Old Latin Mass, was capable of committing multiple mortal sins while celebrating Mass because he infracted on some rule or regulation or what is called a rubric. By very nation, this is grave matter. Therefore, grave matter is the only thing that counts. Today, modern contemporary theology, and by contemporary theology, I would really say, frankly, from about the 19th century on, contemporary moral theology also puts together with grave matter full knowledge and deliberate consent. Full knowledge. I have to know that this is a sin. I have to be aware of this. I have to know this. This, by the way, is why many traditional or more conservative Catholics will frequently recommend to the priest, Father, you should stand up there on Sunday and preach against abortion and preach against premarital sex and preach against masturbation and preach against extramarital sex so people know that it's a sin. And my response is, I don't think there are many Catholics out there who don't know that that's a sin. So committed with full knowledge and deliberate consent, that is, willfully, freely doing this. So mortal sin requires A, it be a very serious matter. B, I have to know it's a very serious matter. And knowing that it's a very serious matter, knowing that it's a sin, essentially I decide to metaphorically flip God the bird. I'm going to do it anyway. That's deliberate consent. Now, Let's unpack these a little bit more. First of all, what do we mean by grave matter? Grave matter is specified by the 10 Commandments. Well, if it's not there, it doesn't fall into grave matter. So if it, for example, let's say eating a steak sub on a Friday prior to 1970. I don't see that in the 10 Commandments anywhere. That's a rule of the church. So by definition, that can't be a mortal sin that destroys charity in the heart. Second part of the gravity of this. The gravity of sins is more or less great. Stealing $10 from Kathy Eldridge is much less grave than murdering Kathy Eldridge. Furthermore, one must also take into account who is wronged. If Kathy Eldridge murders me, that is much less grave than if Kathy Eldridge were to murder Fred Eldridge, because there's a closer bond there. So gravity has these kinds of things to keep in mind with it. So it's basically 10 commandments, a certain level of degree, more or less great, and who the victim of this is. Okay? Catechism 59. Mortal sin requires full knowledge and complete consent. It presupposes knowledge of the sinful character of the act. You have to know that this is a sin. So, for example, let me think of an example of something that someone could do without knowledge. Someone comes through the RCIA process and has been going to church fairly regularly, and all of a sudden December 8th comes around and that person doesn't come to Mass. And somebody says, "Well, I didn't see you in Mass on December 8th." And that person answers, "Well, why should I have been to Mass on December 8th? I didn't know that was what that meant." So there's no full knowledge of missing Mass on that holy day. There's just no full knowledge of it. Okay? It also implies a consent sufficiently deliberate to be a personal choice. A consent deliberate to be a personal choice. For example, I'm driving home today. I hit a slick spot. My car slams into another car, causing that person to bang his or her head against the windshield, causing severe brain damage. I didn't consent or choose for that to happen. Now, I might be more morally culpable if, when that happened, I was going at 75 miles an hour down Route 54, or if at that time I was trying to text the Friars to say I was running late, or fiddling with the radio to find the station that I wanted and I was distracted. That's some culpability. But if I simply hit a slick spot that I didn't see and the car accidentally does that, I didn't choose that. So consent and choice. Now, feigned ignorance. I pretend I don't know these things. Hardness of heart. I do know these things, but I'm going to do it completely anyway. Does not diminish culpability, but increases it. Because again, notice it's will. I'm willfully not knowing this, or I'm willfully hardening my heart. Now, unintentional ignorance can diminish or even remove the imputability of a grave offense. Example, an 8-year-old boy discovers his father's gun container, gun box. It's left open. The 8-year-old boy pulls out the gun and, in playing cops and robbers with his 6-year-old brother, shoots his 6-year-old brother. Did he intend to do that? No. Did he even understand that this was a real gun? No. So that unintentional ignorance diminishes or reduces or removes the guilt. But no one is deemed to be ignorant of the principles of the moral law. So, for example, if I am a married man and I have promised that I will be faithful to my wife forever, and I cheat on the side, I can't say, well, I didn't know that was a sin. Well, it's the very nature of the promise that you made. So there are certain principles of the moral law and conscience. And you can always tell, by the way, when conscience is in play, when people try to hide what they do. If they try to hide what they do, that means some sneaky part of them knows that what they did isn't the right thing to be doing. The promptings of feelings and the passions can also diminish the voluntary and free character of the offense. A wife comes home from work, discovers her husband cheating with the neighbor, is so enraged that she pulls out the unlocked gun box, pulls the gun out, and shoots them both. Enraged, angered, passionately feeling betrayed. All of this diminishes the voluntary and free character of the offense, as can external pressures. External pressures. Let's say I'm a 15-year-old boy from a broken family with a miserable family life. I join a gang because the 25-year-old guy who runs the gang I look up to as the most successful, strong male I've ever met. In order to join the gang, I am told that I have to break into Nora's house and rob her and come out with some of her personal possessions in order to show this is my initiation into the gang. That's an external pressure onto me to commit this sin. Or pathological disorders. Here, for example, a sociopath can commit the most heinous of crimes, the most serious, grave, and miserable of crimes. However, if that sociopath has no will about doing this and no understanding of the moral constraints of it, and is completely operating on his or her own pathological planet, one cannot impute mortal sin to that person. Sin committed through malice, by deliberate choice of evil. I know this is an evil thing to do, and I'm going to enjoy doing it, and damn it, I'm going to do it. That's the gravest, because it's our full connection of the will. Now, Catechism, 1861. Mortal sin is a radical possibility of human freedom, as is love itself. Here, it is truly a corollary in an article of faith that we believe that no matter how stringent all of these conditions are for mortal sin. And we might look at this and say, I find it very difficult that anybody could actually commit a mortal sin according to all of these definitions. We have to admit the fact that there might be someone so morally depraved, so hardened of heart, so stiffened of neck, so self-consumed and self-referential that he or she, in fact, is capable of a mortal sin at this degree. Now, although we can judge that an act is in itself a grave offense, we must entrust judgment of persons to the justice and mercy of God. Here, the classic example of this is, I think we would all agree that the actions committed by Adolf Hitler and the senior Nazi leadership to eradicate Jewry from the face of Europe and to enslave the Slavic populations and enslave people and work them to death for the greater honor and glory of the Aryan race and the fatherland is a completely heinous, reprehensible, grave offense. However, from that, we cannot deduce automatically, A, that they committed a mortal sin, because we do not know what they understood or what they willed. And since we do not have a knowledge of that, we entrust them to the judgment and the justice and the mercy of God. So anyone who says that you did this, therefore it's a mortal sin, therefore you're going to hell, simply doesn't have a good, clean grasp of the catechism. Either because what they're saying you're going to hell for is not a mortal, grave matter, such as, for example, voting Democratic or Republican. It is not a full knowledge of the will. That is, people may be acting out of passions, out of conditioning, etc. Or it may simply not be a full knowledge that people don't understand what they're doing.
Friar?
Yes,
Tim.
Tim.
Tim and Mary. Mary's got a question for you.
Okay.
This is a question that I had before. So I was married before and I had my marriage annulled. And then I went back to work, which I worked at Walsh Jesuit High School. And the father told me I already had my son Travis. And he told me that Travis was a bastard because my marriage never existed. And I wanted to know if that's right or wrong.
Okay. Please accept my apology for the stupidity of my brother priest and the insensitivity of my brother priest. Because A, not only was he insensitive, but B, he was stupid.
Okay.
You're the child of your first marriage, even though the marriage is annulled, is not an illegitimate child.
Okay.
Really.
Good. I didn't think so.
No.
I didn't treat him that way. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Any other points before we move on to continue with the whole question of hell and then getting into purgatory?
Yeah, Friar Tim,
Yeah.
this is Pete.
Hey, Pete.
What about, I went to school with the Sisters of the Notre Dame many years ago, and their views of the universe were quite different than the ones we've evolved to now. And in a way, the church has had its history and evolution to become a little bit more tolerant of other faiths and other faith traditions and other things. Those were not bad intentions on the part of the clergy or the people that were religious at the time. But maybe the implications of what those were created some misunderstanding and difficulty and pain along the way. What happens to that, or is that to the mercy of God in an unknown way?
Well, again, the people who I like, the image that I like to think of is this. When Jesus had a temper tantrum and cleansed the temple and kicked out the merchants in the temple, I can well imagine that the merchants looked at him and said, but we thought we were doing the right thing because this is what the priests and the Levites asked us to do, to provide this service. And in fact, they were right. That's exactly what they were asked to do. So here, shall we say a harsher understanding? We'll talk about it a little bit later on when we get into the question of hell, a more fear-based understanding, a more kind of negative understanding was very much a part of Catholic teaching. Somebody last night asked me why the change, and I would again put the change more or less to this. In the last certainly 500 years of our history, we're becoming more and more aware of interior dynamics. We're becoming more and more aware of feelings, thoughts, actions, impulses, etc. We're becoming much more introspective. And in the past, as I pointed out, people were only interested in the act itself. This act, morally sin, bad, without an understanding of any of the other pieces of it. So as we're much more sophisticated these days and much more introspective and much more aware of our interior stuff that's going on, from another end of this, by the way, this makes my job as a confessor all the more difficult. Because partly what I have to do is begin to try to get a handle not only on the act, but someone's intention and someone's understanding and how free were they to do this. Mary used the example of her own annulment. And essentially, this is exactly what is done within the annulment process. The annulment process not only looks at the act of a marriage, was it done legally, canonically, etc., but what did the two parties understand about their marriage at the time of the marriage, and how free were they to actually contract and understand and do all of these things? Now, that's a relatively recent phenomenon with stuff. Okay? And I think that's, the other point that I want, please keep in mind is I'm quoting the catechism. So it's not like I'm quoting some, underground 1960s, privately published by the Catholic underground kind of thing. This is official church teaching. But it jars many people's understandings of sin and hell and punishment, which is why I chose to do this topic to start our adult faith formation.
Thank you.
Okay?
Friar Tim?
Yes.
Yes, Liz here. So I am really encouraged by what I'm hearing about less black and white, superficial thinking, and though it makes your job harder, that you are called to look more deeply into understanding some variables. That's really encouraging to me about the Catholic faith. I have had people suggest that my gay little brother who died of AIDS was going to hell, and I will never believe that, no matter what faith I practice. And I'm wondering where the church stands now on that kind of issue.
Well, that's actually a fairly easy one. The real question is, your little brother, what choice did he have in his sexual orientation? And if mortal sin requires full consent and full free choice, here we're not even arguing over the morality of homosexual acts or not. We're simply talking to the question of full, free, informed choice and consent. So to argue on that particular piece of it in and of itself goes nowhere. Now, one could argue, perhaps from another end, of multiple sexual sin after multiple sexual sin, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But here, remember, let's flip back to the issue of conscience that we talked about. That if in conscience, your brother believed that his sexual expression was a part of who he was, that's his conscience. And that's respected. And conscience overcomes any imputability of guilt and sin.
Mm.
Okay?
Mm. Thank you.
Catherine, you were going to say, had a question as well. Yeah.
Yes, hi. I struggle a little bit with one of the things you said before about if Kathy murdered you
Yeah.
versus Kathy murdering her husband. I totally understand like the depth of relationship and connection and how that's a piece of it. But I have a difficult time separating the value of one human life over another.
Yeah.
Can you shed a little light on that?
Well, in this particular case, let's take the Kathy and Fred case. They're married. There's a sacramental bond there that is deeper and more demanding of Kathy and Fred than Kathy's relationship with me. It's not that one human life is superior to another, but the circumstances of whom you're killing, particularly with this sacramental bond, is more grave. It's that end of it.
I do understand that, but then there's also this.
Right. But there's, from the other end of it, no, that's the way to understand it, is the connection that is there makes this another level of heinous.
Mm-hmm.
Again, human life is human life. Okay, so it's not like one is more important than another. But the particular circumstance of how you connected to that person can raise or lower the guilt ratio. I'm lacking words for how to answer it.
So there's zero difference between
Correct.
the value of one life over another, but there
Correct.
is a different level of wrongness when you're murdering someone you're not married to.
Or again, you know, a parent murdering his or her child, or a child murdering his or her parent is different than the killing of a stranger.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, now let's get into a little bit of the experience of hell. And let me close you down here and get to that. Oh. The experience of hell. That's the one I want. Okay. The experience of hell. Jesus often speaks of Gehenna, of the unquenchable fire reserved for those who to the end of their lives refuse to believe and be converted. Again, refuse to believe and be converted, where both soul and body can be lost. Jesus solemnly proclaims that he will send his angels and they will gather all evildoers. Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire. Now, here, we need to understand the experience of hell as an eternally miserable experience, not an eternally miserable place. So, for example, let's try to get the whole question of frustration. Think of when you've had a completely miserable day, everything has gone wrong. You're trying to call up a repair line. You're put on hold for half hour. You're getting more and more angry, more and more frustrated, more and more fed up, and you're sitting there, and all of a sudden you hear hello, and then a click, and you get the dial tone, and you realize you lost them. Now, that feeling of wanting to take your cell phone and throw it out the window or stomp on it, or that feeling of wanting to scream at the phone, or that feeling of just wanting to drop all kinds of expletive deleteds all over the place. Picture, if you would, what it would be like to have that feeling for all eternity. For all eternity. From another end of it, picture when you are dehydrated and you are completely and thoroughly thirsty, and that feeling of overbearing thirst can never in all eternity be fulfilled. Or the hunger pangs are rolling, your stomach is wrestling, you are famished, you want to eat, you feel you could eat the side of a cow if it were offered to you, and there is nothing there. Furthermore, you go into your pantry and you discover that your husband ate the last bit of food and left the empty wrapper for you. Picture if that were for all of eternity. Now, suffering, which affects the whole human person. So far, we've talked spiritually, frustrations, longing. But picture also how that is materially, because at a given point at the last judgment, we will be reunited with our bodies and have an experience of a spiritual body that is material in some way, shape, or form. And think how often we use bodily pain to express feeling. That this person is a pain in the neck, that my teeth are so clenched because I'm so angry and I'm biting my tongue. Or the veins in my neck or in my forehead were popping out because I was so angry. Or my shoulders were so hunched up that I had a pain in my shoulder and in my lower back. Or this person is just simply a pain in the, put it whatever point you want to put in your body, etc., etc., etc. Picture that depth of miserable experience as an eternal experience. 1035. The teaching of the church affirms the existence of hell and its eternity. Immediately after death, the souls of those who die in a state of mortal sin descend into hell, where they suffer the punishment of hell, eternal life. The chief punishment of hell is eternal separation from God, in whom alone humanity can possess the life and happiness for which they were created and for which they long. Here again, the necessary corollary to believe that it is possible for someone to be so self-centered, so self-consumed, so self-righteous, so self-involved, so arrogant and narcissistic and headstrong that they will do whatever they want without any regard to God or any regard to anything else, means that there must be an experience that corresponds to that inveterate self-involvement. It is a necessary corollary to human free will. Now, the pain part of this, we need to get out of our head the notion that somebody, i.e. God, or Satan or a devil, is inflicting pain on us. Rather, we need to begin to meditate and think that this pain is the pain of loss. That is, I had this elect status of the children of God. I once had God say, "You are my beloved son. You are my beloved daughter. In you I am very well pleased." And for a brief nanosecond in my life, I experienced that, and then I refused it. And the pain of separation. That, in a sense, I could see what I could be, but I'm separated from that. And I'm separated from that because I ultimately have chosen to do this. I ultimately have chosen to do this. We continue. The affirmations of sacred scripture and the teachings of the church on the subject of hell are a call to the responsibility incumbent upon people to make use of their freedom in view of their eternal destiny. They are at the same time an urgent call to conversion. We know neither the day nor the hour. We should follow the advice of the Lord and watch constantly so that we may merit to enter with him into the marriage feast and be numbered among the blessed, and not into the outer darkness. Now here, notice in this number, 1036, there is never the mention of the word fear. Yet that is precisely what very commonly much catechism in the past taught us about fear. There's a very fascinating and classic text in church history by the French scholar Jean Delumeau entitled Sin and Fear, the Emergence of a Western Guilt Culture, 13th to the 18th centuries. Essentially, from the middle of the Middle Ages up until the early modern period, Christianity was consumed with fear, and fear of sinning and dying in sin and being cast into all eternity for our sinfulness. Fear. The fear-based catechism about this. Those fire and brimstone sermons that one heard. Those fire and brimstone retreat talks that one heard over the course of time. Fear was the predominating piece of all of this. And contemporary moral theology is attempting to shift beyond that, away from fear, but responsibility incumbent upon people to make use of their freedom. You can fear and guilt people into avoiding sin. It's very difficult to use fear and guilt into making people do good. Here, for example, note how the Council of Trent even understood and put this into one of its formal prayers, the very traditional act of contrition. O my God, I am heartily sorry for having offended thee, and I detest all my sins because of thy just punishment. That is imperfect contrition. But most of all, because they offend thee, my God, who are all good and deserving of all of my love. That's perfect contrition. Imperfect contrition, perhaps using fear, works with little children. It's harder to make your 18 or 19-year-old do what you want by scaring the bejesus out of them, because they simply don't fear this anymore. So contemporary moral theology is much more interested in saying, okay, sin is one piece, avoiding sin is a good thing, but there is the whole question of doing good. The image that I used last week or the week before about consciously expanding the capacity of the container, constantly stretching our hearts by more charity, by more pardon, by more forgiveness, by more mercy, by more generosity, by deeper prayer, by deeper experiences of penitence, etc. Catechism 1037. God predestines no one to go to hell. For this, a willful turning away from God, i.e., a mortal sin, is necessary, and persistence in it until the end. In the Eucharistic liturgy and in the daily prayers of her faithful, the Church implores the mercy of God, who does not want any to perish, but all to come to repentance. And here it quotes Eucharistic prayer number 1. Father, accept this offering from your whole family. Grant us your peace in this life, save us from final damnation, and count us among those you have chosen. Here we come into the question, is anyone actually experiencing hell? And the Church never has and never will make a definitive declaration of this, because ultimate judgment is up to God. Now, notice that the Church does, and fairly frequently, make the opposite declaration. That is, that this person is enjoying the eternal beatitude. That's what we call canonization. That's what we call saintliness. So the Church will put this stress on the positive, but will not in any way, shape, or form declare the negative, again, because of the hopeful nature that even at the very last nanosecond, someone who was willfully turned away from God and persisted in it at the last nanosecond may ask for the mercy of God and admit that he or she is wrong. Now, I'm stopping sharing, and any questions on this notion of the experience of hell?
Boy, we
Well,
had a bunch of hell questions last night.
Yeah.
I just have a comment that I think I get tastes of hell when I forget God's nearness. When I think of hell as a separation, an experience of separation, I experience that when I forget that God's love is ever present, unconditional. I'm always, my spiritual director reminded me that I'm not just seeking God, but God is always seeking me.
And here, again, let's not overly piously dismiss Jesus's prayer on the cross, quoting Psalm 22, my God, why have you abandoned me? I feel abandoned at this moment. And again, the opposite end of this, we talked about last week when talking about the experience of heaven, that mystical contemplative insights, that flash of the Holy Spirit, what is sometimes called infused grace or infused contemplation, gives us a foretaste of this already from the positive end. And Liz, what you're talking about is already a foretaste of it from the negative end. This feeling abandoned, this feeling separated, this feeling in the unutterable coldness of not knowing the love of God. John, can you unmute yourself? Yeah, here we go.
Sure. The church's position on choosing not to, shall we say, determine that people end up in hell, sometimes puts us in a difficult quandary. You raised a great example of that with the Nazis. Right?
Yep.
In a sense, being put in a position of defending this escape hatch, as some people want to call it, and refusal to call evil in the strict, one or the other of at least some other traditions. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how we might be able to frame that. I think in God's mercy and all, I think works easier defending it on the positive side.
Yeah.
But we can pick our favorite historical figure or whoever, and saying we don't know that conversation between that individual and God, and that's a very important part of our moral theology.
Here, I would say that the church is very circumspect in not confusing herself with God. That it does recognize the sovereign majesty of God as the ultimate judge of these things. And the church also recognizes that there are certain places where it cannot really go. For example, into the depths of human consciousness, into the depths of human freedom. So the fine line, always apologetically here, that we have to keep in mind is to underline the heinousness of the act, the objective disorder of the act, the objective evil of the act, the objective abhorrence of the act, but be careful to not let that bleed too much into the same level of condemnation for the person who did the act. Because again, here we don't really know what that person understood, how free that person was, and at the very end, was there some glimmer of repentance? Was there some glimpse of a warmth that touched their otherwise, completely Grinch-like soul? And there's where we are. This is also, by the way, where, like it or not, Catholicism is a hopelessly hopeful religion and a hopelessly positive religion. That we simply have, as much as we've talked about fear and the negative ends of things, as much as we've talked about all of those, in itself, in its theology, it is hopeful to the very maximum degree. And it's hopeful even at this, that horrid people are not beyond the pale. Which, by the way, part of it has been reiterated very strongly in the Pope's last encyclical, that no matter how horrible the criminal act is of a criminal, the state does not have the right to put them to death. And you underline always the horrendous act, but separate it from the person.
Friar Tim, another
Yes.
question. Is there any role for intuition in this? There's a top-down doctrinal approach, but in my life, I've experienced contact with warlords in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, who convey without words or without, even though you may know what their acts behind the scene are, there's just an permeance of unease and feels like evil, I think is the word.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure, we don't know the ways of God, but does God give us intuition to feel those kinds of things, or I'm not sure where to go with that.
Okay, certainly we trust our gut. And if our gut intuitively says that there's evil here, we trust that. Now, here's where theology would hold, that is, that while intuitively we trust our intuition and we recognize and accept the fact that this person is consumed with evil, we at the same time have to hold that being consumed with evil does not dehumanize him or her completely. There is still some semblance of humanity there. There is some semblance still of good there. There is some semblance that being created in the image and likeness of God and being marked by God is still somewhere in an extremely difficult manner to find, but theologically, I must claim that that is still there. And if that is still there, then there's hope. And that's where theology comes into it. Here, I don't mean to slip into this, there's no such thing as bad people. There's no such, I don't mean to slip into, I certainly do not want to sugarcoat the existence of malevolence and the existence of malice. What I am trying to do here is to affirm a very Catholic belief that while there is the existence of malevolence and malice and evil, it does not completely overcome our status as God's beloved daughters and sons. And in fact, no matter to the depths of corruption and horror that a person is, it is a tenet of Catholic belief that if that person were to turn to God in some way, grace does come in and regenerate the interior mass of crap. That it does, the possibility is there, but the possibility is there only if that person wants it. And that falls back to the question of personal responsibility. And you can't scare the bejesus out of them to get them to do that. They got to freely turn.
Thank you.
All right. Now let's get to purgatory. Catechism, 1030. All who die in God's grace and friendship, but still imperfectly purified, are indeed assured of their eternal salvation. But after death, they undergo purification so as to achieve the holiness necessary to enjoy the joy of heaven. What is holiness? Flip to another catechism, 2809. The holiness of God is the inaccessible center of his eternal mystery. In making humanity in his image and likeness, God crowned us with glory and honor. But by sinning, humanity fell short of the glory of God. From that time on, God was to manifest his holiness by revealing and giving his name in order to restore humanity to the image of the Creator. Holiness, then, is being the image of the Creator. Wherever sin has marred that, dented that, punctured that, stained that, corrupted that, etc., is the imperfection that we all bear, which must be purified. 1031. The church gives the name purgatory to this final purification of the elect, which is entirely different from the punishment of the damned. So again, many people have a notion that the experience of hell and the experience of purgatory are exactly the same thing, with the one difference that purgatory, you know, someday you're getting out. It is entirely different. The church formulated her doctrine of faith in purgatory, especially the councils of Florence and Trent. The tradition of the church, by reference to certain texts of scripture, speaks of a cleansing fire. As for certain lesser faults, we must believe that before the final judgment, there is a purifying fire. Now, what does this purification look like? Try to give you some examples. It's purification in terms of a hopeful preparation. So, for example, let's say I want to someday teach epidemiology at the University of North Carolina. That's my goal. However, I have to get through a whole level of doctoral studies and a whole level of testing and a whole level of work in order to get there. And I have to purify myself of what are the things that are not quite right about where I want to come from. And I mold myself slowly into this. Is it a painful process? Yes. Is getting through your doctorate a painful process? Yes. Is the goal of it worth it? Yes. Let's take a second thing, a hopeful preparation. Let's say my hip is degenerated and every single step hurts. And my doctor tells me, I would really want you to lose 30 pounds before I do the surgery, because the surgery would otherwise be too dangerous for you. The purification of losing those 30 pounds, the difficulty and the pain that there is in walking with that, hurt and purify me in some way, but open me up to the possibility of what it is that I'm called to. Another example of this, I'm 15 and a half years old. There's nothing I want more than my driver's license than to escape from my parents. But I have to go through the drudgery of driver's ed class in order to get that. That's the purification, the necessary steps that I have to make my way through in order to experience the goal that I want or the goal to which I'm called. Now, keep in mind that, as we pointed out on the first week, at our particular judgment, everything is revealed to us. Both the sin that we have always failed to recognize or to address, as well as the good that I have done, as well as the good that I could have done and omitted to do because I was lazy or self-centered, etc., etc. Here, I can no longer BS myself. Here, I can no longer play that I'm in denial. Here, I can no longer just simply want to avoid all of this kind of stuff. It is right there in front of me for all time. The stuff that I did wrong, the stuff that I did well, and the stuff that I could have done well. The classic difference between sins of commission and sins of omission. And what I've got is a huge, lengthy experience of coulda, woulda, shoulda. I could have done better. I would have done better had I already known. I should have paid more attention to preaching. I could have done this. I would have done that. I should have done that. The more we are completely caught up in our own stuff and we find difficulty forgiving ourselves and we find difficult being magnanimous, the more difficult this process, this experience is for us. To put it in another way, the tighter I've tied the knots of sin of my life, the harder it is to unravel them. It is a purgative experience to have to work my way through all my couldas, wouldas, and shouldas. The third thing that is very important to put in mind here is many of us think that purgatory is the place where we are punished for our unredeemed, not mortal sin. We are not punished for that as much as we feel sorrow for that. And sorrow is by nature purgative. When one weeps because of the awful things that one does, when one weeps because of the awful things one has thought or contemplated, when one weeps out of sorrow and solidarity with all of those who are suffering around us, that is, by definition, purgative. It gets something out of us. Is a purgative experience difficult? Yes. Any of you over the age of 50 that's had a colonoscopy recognizes that the purgative night before that colonoscopy is not a cup of tea. It's a purgative, difficult thing to have to go through. But one goes through it because of the anticipated good that comes to this. Remember, this is at one's particular judgment where one recognizes and accepts that I am God's elect, I am assured of my salvation, but I'm imperfectly purified, cleansed, clean. To put it in another typical scriptural imagery, gold is frequently intermixed with dross. One has to purify gold in a refiner's fire in order to separate the precious from that which has tarnished it. Now, this experience, remember, is outside of time. Traditional Catholic prayer has frequently used the categories of time to give us some notion of this. You say this prayer for 7 days free in purgatory or 7 years free in purgatory. All of that comes into another whole category of maintaining spiritual contact. Catechism 1032. The teaching of purgatory is also based on the practice of prayer for the dead, already mentioned in sacred scripture. From the beginning, the church has honored the memory of the dead, going way back to the earliest catacombs, and offered prayers in suffrage for them, above all, the Eucharistic sacrifice. In every single Mass, part of the Eucharistic prayer is to remember the dead. Every single Mass, the last intercession in the general intercessions is to remember the dead. Every single evening prayer in the Liturgy of the Hours, the last intercession is to remember the dead, so that thus purified, they may attain the beatific vision of God. The church also commends almsgiving. I generously give of myself in memory of my departed parents. What does this mean? If my departed parents are still undergoing their own personal purification for their imperfections, this means that they know I am still thinking of them and praying for them, and they are consoled by that fact. And I, in turn, have some hope that we are still connected in the communion of saints, a doctrine that we proclaim each and every time we say the creed on Sundays. Indulgences. An indulgence is simply an incentive to do some good act. So an indulgence is simply a little push to do a prayer, do an act of piety, do an act of charity, etc. An indulgence, for all intents and purposes, is a 10% off coupon or 25% off coupon. It's an incentive to go and buy that product because you get something off of it. It incentivizes the sale. It's a 2-for-1 sale. Similarly, what we're doing, if we pay attention to indulgences and we apply them to our dead, we are simply saying, I am incentivized to remember you in prayer, and you need this coupon at the moment more than I do. Works of penance undertaken on behalf of the dead. That I can simply deny myself something and offer that up for the perseverance in prayer of someone who is still going through the intensely difficult and purgative process of dealing with their couldas, shouldas, and wouldas. Here, two things important to keep in mind. The first, purgatory is the last and perhaps the greatest expression of the mercy of God for us. That is, at our particular judgment, God could have simply said, you got too much negative on your plate. You got too much garbage you didn't clear out. You got too much that you wasted. Sorry, you don't make it in. However, God provides this experience for us to work through all of our own human limitations. That's purgative, because we're constantly stuck with the coulda, shoulda, woulda. I'm always reminded of the phrase of St. Augustine, one of the greatest of converted sinners, who in his autobiography stated, late have I loved thee, O radiant beauty, O ancient God, late have I loved thee. And I'm going to now stop the sharing and come back and see if any comments or thoughts on purgatory. John, go ahead.
Yeah, just a question that kind of combines the last couple of items that you had on the catechism. Given that, I'll call it our disposition, right? Given that is based on our free will choice, why, given the checkered history of it, does the church still talk about indulgence and, in a sense, paying bail for somebody else when it was our choice to end up there? And it would seem, at least from a descriptive, logical perspective, to be more consistent to say we have to deal with that rather than having somebody be able to sort of buy our way, if you will,
Yeah.
I'll be out of it. And how does that then fit back into, we chose that pathway?
Right. We're really not buying our dead people out of purgatory. Much as Martin Luther claimed to have heard Johann Tetzel sing, "Whenever a coin in the collection basket clings, a soul from purgatory springs." That's not what we're really talking about. What we are talking about, however, is two things connected. One, while you have to assume responsibility for yourself, that does not give me the license to simply wash my hands of you. Again, think of it in this term. No matter how much an adult child might screw up, mom or dad is not likely to simply wash their hands completely of them. They have to assume responsibility for their own life. They may have to deal with their own bankruptcy. They may have to go to jail and serve 7-year term. They have to do all these kind of things, but you're not going to abandon them with it. Here then, the indulgence, more than a get out of jail free card or a time off allowance, is more a fervent prayer sent out such that you might continue to persevere in your difficult task of coming to grips with yourself. That you might not lose hope, that you be comforted in some way that I've thought of you and connected to you. That's more in the way of it. Here, indulgences almost always have this quantifiable thing to them that make them slightly distasteful. And I personally pay no attention to indulgences whatsoever. Personally, me. Okay? However, they do serve for some people to incentivize. So I'm not gonna get rid of them. How would I put this? Let me give you another image that I use frequently. The Gospel of Matthew says, "Blessed is that steward who knows how to take things both old and new out of the storeroom." The analogy of that is there are certain things that are better left in the storeroom. And the church, with her 2,000-year history spanning the globe and all kinds of cultures, has lots of weird artifacts hanging around in grandma's attic. And some of them it's best to leave there. Some of them you can bring back out. Some of them need a little bit of rehabbing, a little refurbishing, but we've got all of this stuff there. And indulgences, at least for me, is one of them. But I would never countenance or I would never downplay someone else who has a really strong attachment to indulgences.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that the solidarity comment that you made puts a very different spin, certainly than most of us were raised on, right? With the sort of exchange notion that we are mindful of them in, I don't want to push this very far, but given the many cultures that have a memory of the dead as part of their culture, and learning from their life experience and reflecting on that, it seems to be a different kind of understanding of that relationship.
Yeah.
That helps a lot.
Last Thursday, whatever the 30th of September was, the 30th of September was the memorial of St. Jerome. On that day, Pope Francis wrote a letter commending the study of sacred scripture to all Catholics. But to me, the remarkable thing was that he noted that on that day, September 30th, 1,600 years ago, Jerome died. So we were recalling someone's death anniversary, 1600 years. Now, within the Friars, we have a tradition that each day in the evening, we remember the dead guys who died from the province on this day. When you live in Italy, you're sometimes praying for people who died in 1236. And you're still praying for them. And you're still remembering them. And sometimes I thought to myself, like, boy, if that guy's in purgatory, I can't even figure out what his life was like. But I'll pray for him anyway, somewhere along the line. But it does get to those points of it. And the question of solidarity, the question of connection is intrinsic to our faith, that it is not solo or solipsistic. I used this last night, Treese will remember it, and I'll use it again. That one of the metaphors that I've heard used to describe hell is a banquet at which everybody is perpetually hungry. Well, why is everybody perpetually hungry? Because the rule is that you can only take the food with a 6-foot spoon. And nobody has the arm width to get the 6-foot spoon and get it to their own mouth. However, everyone has the capacity to take the 6-foot spoon and feed the person across from them. But they refuse to do it. Either because they don't care, because I'm not getting the food, or I don't trust the SOB because he might not feed me in return. So this level of selfishness, this level of self-regard, this level of self-righteousness goes completely against the solidarity that we're talking here. And this solidarity continues into the great beyond, into the communion of saints. Yes.
Friar Tim, a little bit more about purgatory. And my question essentially is the person still have an experience, in that experience, is the person still possessing free will, possessing choice, free choice? All the many rich examples that you've used to help us grasp and sort of, again, in some fashion, experience it through what you're sharing with us, that sense of purgatory. What's going through my mind is, well, that implies that the person is still exercising choice.
Mm-hmm.
That and well, choice. Oh,
okay.
Is that
earlier on? If you go back to the catechism sections on particular judgment, it tells us very clearly that our moment of choice ends there. Now, we are still free, okay? But we are free in the Christian sense of freedom for either eternal beatitude or eternal damnation, okay? We're free for that. It's not like we have freedom of choice, A, B, C, D, E, F, or G. We're free to go to this, or we're free to choose that. But that's the time then, at this point, like the die is cast, so to speak. And death is that irrevocable moment. Okay? Now remember, again, that while death is that irrevocable moment, we do not know exactly at what moment death occurs. So at that moment of particular judgment, or in the nanosecond before it, and we have some glimpse of God, and we turn our hearts and minds to God at that point, is that possible and still enough? That's an open kind of a question. We always remain free, but free not as much in the sense of making various choices or kind of reforming or changing our lives at that point. The die is cast. But let me put it this way. We remain free to accept the logical conclusion of the choices we've made. That, I think that catches it. Does that make some sense?
Yes. Yeah.
If your question is somewhere along the lines of saying, going through all of this purgation is just too much work, let me just check out of this and drop into hell. Okay, that is a no. Much like from the other end of this purgation is too much work, just let me into heaven as I am. That's also a no. That's the irrevocable part of where you've come in.
I have a question, Friar Tim.
Yes, Trees.
I was just thinking about suffering, and I see people that suffer immeasurably sometimes. Theologically, does that also kind of pay to get through purgatory?
Suffering can certainly be redemptive and purifying. It can also be debilitating and worsening. It simply is what we do with it. So if I'm suffering and spending my entire time whining and complaining and BM&C'ing about it, that suffering is not redemptive. If, on the other hand, I say, all right, for whatever reason, this is my share of suffering in the cross of Christ.
Yeah.
And let it redeem me in some way. Okay, and remember, suffering is not merely physical. Just think again of the suffering of a mother helplessly watching her child suffer, or helplessly watching her child make poor decisions in life. What do you do with that? How do you accept that or not? So a patient and calm acceptance of suffering, not courting it, all right, not looking for it, not disguised spiritual sadomasochism here, but just simply accepting that this is the particular cross that I'm carrying this day, and I'm just going to carry it to the best of my ability, is redemptive in itself. Does that work towards polishing off some of our rough edges? Yeah. Does that work towards getting rid of some of the dross from our gold? Yeah. Does that work on getting rid of some of the tarnish that's stuck on our silverware? Yeah. If we work with it. If we don't work with it, it just adds more on. Yes. Unmute. Okay.
Another question is really very simply, is our belief or faith, I'm not sure which word is more appropriate here, but our belief regarding purgatory of the same significance and or importance as our belief in transubstantiation?
Ooh, that's a very difficult one in which to check it. It is certainly a dogma of the church. Okay, so if one accepts the dogma, one accepts the teaching authority of the church, one accepts the teaching authority of the church. It is not as absolutely central, for example, as belief in the Trinity, or belief in the incarnation of Jesus Christ, or belief in the real presence of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist. Transubstantiation is simply an explanation of a mystery. Okay? So it's certainly not of that category of it, but it is a part of who we are. And again, frankly speaking, I appreciate a God who would look at me and say, all right, you tried. You don't have your act completely together yet. I get it. You worked with it as well as you can. You got a lot of rough edges yet. Let me give you one more chance to work on your rough edges. I appreciate a God like that. To me, it's a very merciful, kind of hopeful, benevolent notion of God. Because God is giving me the opportunity once more to get my act together in view of what he's always called me to do.
Thank you.
Yes, John.
Yeah, just a question on the woulda, coulda, shoulda aspect of the purgation. And I'll just call it a distinction between the woulda, coulda, shoulda that derives from a decision which at the time you had a choice to make and you chose deliberately a course of action. And subsequently you have genuine remorse for that.
Yeah.
As opposed to, I guess, a woulda, coulda, shoulda deriving more from a self-flagellation, sort of that kind of thing. Well,
Right.
had I known that, you know,
Right.
kind of
Right.
psychic loop that people can.
Right. Because again, at your particular judgment, everything will have been revealed in all its fullness. So you can't hide behind self-flagellation. Because it's not, I mean, this is what it is. Okay, it's all out there in all of its stark beauty, or shall we say, disfigured imagery. There it is. And I have to grasp that and accept that this is who I am and what I did. And there's no self-flagellation because it's all out there. No more imagine, no more feigning, no more denial, none of those kinds of things.
I guess more what I was referring to is the difference between at the time you knew that there were consequences of a decision, and you had some sense that the choice you made was wrong, as opposed to I'll call it Monday morning quarterbacking.
Yeah.
Right, and saying, well, had we known that X, Y, and Z was going to happen, which you didn't at the time.
Right.
And
Here,
deriving, well, if I could go back and do that, knowing
Yeah.
now.
knowing what
Right.
yeah. Here, this is the difference between real remorse and just simply uselessly beating yourself up. And there is a distinction between those two things. Real remorse and just kind of beating yourself up over things which you didn't have control, you didn't have full knowledge. Okay? Now, on this very hopeful note of purgatory, we'll come back next Wednesday. If you click on your Zoom on Tuesday, I'm not going to let you in because I'm not going to be at my computer. Next Wednesday, same time, and we'll talk about the final hope of the promise of a new heaven and a new earth. Okay? Thank you all very much for your attention. Treese?
Did it help to receive the PowerPoint presentation ahead of time?
All right.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Okay.
God
And
bless.
again,
Thank
you all know where you can find the catechism, correct? If you don't have a hardbound copy of it. It's freely available either on the Vatican website, www.vatican.va, or on the USCCB website, www.usccb.org. And just find the links in there and find the languages in there, and it's all. And you just got to click down, and you've got the numbers for all of it. Okay? God bless. See you all.
Ciao. Bye,
Take care.
everybody.
God bless.